This evening, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to take some time to remind the American people of the nature of a sworn enemy of the United States, whose leaders stay, as they have for the past 36 years, continue to chant death to America. That enemy, Mr. Speaker, is Iran. Mr. Speaker, the permanent members of the UN Security Council, the United States, United Kingdom, France, Russia, and China, plus Germany, this group known as the P5+1, have engaged in negotiations with Iran in an attempt to halt Iran's development of nuclear weapons. Of significant note, unlike the negotiations that we had with North Korea years ago regarding its pursuit of nuclear weapons, those negotiations included the United States and North Korea's neighbors, China, Russia, South Korea, and Japan. Iran's regional neighbors and closest targets, however, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Israel, were not invited to participate in these talks. A framework for an agreement with the P5+1 and Iran was reached in April. But that framework is simply inadequate to halt the regime's march to a nuclear weapon. Iran cannot be allowed to get a nuclear weapon. Such an event would set off a destabilizing arms race in the region of the world that is already afire with sectarian hatred. It is a real threat that Iran would use such a weapon against Israel, Europe, or with its continued development of long-range intercontinental ballistic missiles against the United States. Iran's surface-to-surface missile expansion is a threat typically left out of discussions over its nuclear programs, but we cannot ignore that Iran has now built itself the largest and most sophisticated long-range missile arsenal in the Middle East. The current nuclear framework agreed to in April represents a significant shift in U.S. policy regarding Iran's nuclear program. Under the agreed-upon framework, Iran's nuclear centrifuges will be allowed to keep spinning for the next decade. This is the first presidential administration to agree to a deal that allows Iran to continue enriching uranium, thereby legitimizing Iran's entire nuclear program. Importantly, the administration's notion that oversight from international atomic inspectors can keep Iran from developing a weapon is simply not true. For over a decade, Iran has evaded the very oversight body tasked with conducting inspections and monitoring its nuclear stockpiles. If the past 15 years are any indication, we know that Iran will incur enormous financial costs and wreck its domestic economy, all to continue enriching uranium and developing and testing nuclear weapons at secret facilities and undeclared sites. And in light of the past 15 years, we know Iran will continue to evade the international community just as it did when building and operating its Natanz and Fordo facilities in complete secrecy, concealed from international atomic inspectors. Those who choose can ignore the writing on the wall and whitewash Iran's previous violations of numerous international treaties while continuing to operate its covert nuclear program. Those who choose can ignore the hostile rhetoric that still spews from the mouths of Iran's so-called reformers, including moderates, so-called, like President Rouhani, who publicly brags about Iran's ability to deceive the West, using stall tactics at the negotiating table, when all the while Iran continues making progress behind the scenes on its nuclear program. Mr. Speaker, many of us have grave concerns about the deal being negotiated and that will leave Iran on the path to nuclear weapons, while allowing for complete relief from the sanctions that forced Iran to the table. I suggest that even if Iran abandoned its path to the bomb, it is completely reasonable to leave the sanctions in place until Iran stops the terror campaign it has been on for the last 36 years. I simply ask fellow Americans to be skeptical of any assurance that Iran has stopped or will stop pursuing a nuclear weapon. Just 6 months ago, President Obama used these Iran negotiations to silence critics who oppose his foreign policy. In an interview with CNN, the President suggested that the year and a half of ongoing negotiations with Iran is probably the first time that Iran, quote, has not advanced its nuclear program in the last decade. And President Obama didn't stop there. He went on to assure people that this freeze on Iran's nuclear program had been verified by the UN and the international atomic inspectors, who acknowledged that Iran has not made progress. Yet we know now that the opposite is true. In the last 18 months of negotiations, Iran has not frozen its nuclear program by any stretch, but has actually increased its nuclear stockpiles by 20%. Iran's nuclear program is a very serious problem, but it is only one of the dimensions of the threat that Iran poses to the world. It remains only one part of an overall program of terror that has been carried out by Iran for a very long time. I wanted to offer this special order about Iran today because it's a very important anniversary. 30 years ago today, Navy Seabee diver Robert Stethem was singled out and murdered by Iranian-backed terrorists because he was a United States service member. He was only 23 years old at that time, the same age that I was. His murder was at the hands of Hezbollah, an Iran-funded militant terror group aboard the hijacked TWA Flight 847. We can never forget the barbaric way in which he was murdered and his body subsequently dropped from the plane onto the Beirut runway. Master Chief Constructionman Stethem, we will never forget the sacrifice you gave for our country, and together we pray for your family. Robert was born in Connecticut to parents Richard and Patricia. Just as his mother and father had done, Robert followed his family footsteps and signed up to serve in the U.S. Navy shortly before he would celebrate his 20th birthday. He was returning from an assignment in Greece aboard TWA Flight 847, headed to Beirut, when the aircraft was seized by militants. Bobby Stethem never got to pursue the hopes and dreams that every American has, settling down, raising a family, and contributing more of himself to this wonderful, exceptional nation. His parents lost the comfort and grace of seeing a son grow old, and his siblings lost a lifelong friend and companion. And lest we forget, it was Iranian-backed terrorists who put an end to this young life. Bobby Stethem was one victim of Iran's reign of terror. There have been many more. Iran's hostility toward America emerged in full force in 1979 when it failed to protect the American embassy in Tehran and allowed radical Islamist students to seize the embassy and take American diplomats and Marines hostage, holding 52 of them hostage for 444 days. The attempted rescue of their hostages in April 1980 resulted in the deaths of 8 Americans, and Iran bears full responsibility for those deaths. Throughout the 1980s, Iran funded terrorists in Lebanon who were responsible for the deaths of hundreds of Americans. To recall some of the events, between 1982 and 1992, Iranian-backed Hezbollah systematically kidnapped 96 foreign nationals, 25 of them Americans. At least 8 died in captivity. Some were murdered, while others died as a result of inadequate medical attention. On April 18, 1983, Hezbollah bombed the American embassy in Beirut, killing 63, including 17 Americans. 6 months later, on October 23, 1983, a Hezbollah suicide bomber drove a truck laden with more than 15,000 pounds of explosives into the U.S. Marine barracks at the Beirut airport, killing 240 Marines and wounding more than 100 more. 58 French paratroopers were also killed. On September 20, 1984, Hezbollah struck again with another bombing, this time carrying out an attack on the U.S. Embassy Annex in Beirut, killing 24 people, including 2 Americans. The reign of terror moved from the 1980s to the 1990s, when Iranian-backed terrorists attacked the Khobar Towers complex in Saudi Arabia in 1996, killing 19 airmen of the United States Air Force. Iran continued its attacks on Americans throughout the 2000s and the 2010s with its backing of terrorists who killed American service members using IEDs in Iraq and Afghanistan. An article from March of 2015 quotes a former U.S. war general who served in Iraq and estimates that Iran was responsible for about 1/3 of U.S. casualties during the war, which amounts to approximately 1,500 sons and daughters of America who never came home alive. In addition to its attacks on Americans, Iran-backed terrorists attacked other nations around the world. In March of 1992, Hezbollah detonated a truck bomb at the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires, killing 29 people and injuring 240 others. On July 18, 1994, Iran bombed a Jewish community center in Buenos Aires, which took the lives of 85 innocent civilians and injured more than 300. Again, in July of 2012, Hezbollah operatives claimed responsibility after a suicide bomber detonated a bomb on an Israeli bus in Bulgaria, killing 5 Israelis and wounding 30 people. Until Iran stops its export of terror and stops its threats to Israel, the United States and other nations, no sanctions relief should be granted. If Iran does not abandon its nuclear ambitions, sanctions should be increased. I'm privileged this evening, Mr. Speaker, to be joined by some colleagues. I'd like to yield for such time as he may consume my colleague from New York, Congressman Zeldin, who represents a part of Long Island. Congressman Zeldin is a great addition to this House, serving in his freshman year, also a veteran of the U.S. Army. I yield to Congressman Zeldin.
I thank the gentleman for yielding and for his leadership on this issue. Iran is a nation led by a regime threatening the stability of the free world. That is nothing new. Iran has a long history of supporting terrorism and working to overthrow foreign governments. Since 1984, over 30 years ago, the United States has called Iran a state sponsor of terrorism, not only for their direct participation in attacks, but for their financing and other support for others who pursue terror. Iran has brought instability to the Middle East and does not act in good faith, blowing up mock U.S. warships, pledging to wipe Israel off the map, developing ICBMs, and chanting in their streets, "Death to America." The Iranian government threatens peace and democracy all across the globe. Nuclear weapons in the hands of our enemies harms the security of our freedoms and liberties that America cherishes and has worked so hard to defend. The Iranian government came to the negotiating table dealt an impossible hand, you would think. In Texas Hold'em, they'd call it a 7-2 offsuit. In 2009, when the economy was doing better in Iran, oil was $100 a barrel. Millions of Iranians took to the streets to overthrow their own government. The President of the United States essentially made it out to be just their problem, not ours, and did not engage. The predicament we find ourselves in here today. The President of the United States comes into office inheriting pocket aces when he sits down at the table. And pocket aces happen to be the best hand you can have in Texas Hold'em. And the President sits down with the leadership of the Iranian government and asks to swap hands in the spirit of fairness and equality and good faith. Yes, the pocket aces earned on the backs of generations of Americans who have shed blood. They have fought and died to protect the United States, the greatest nation on God's green earth. And as a negotiating style, the President swaps hands with the bad guys. As we inch closer to the June 30th deadline, I want to reinforce that a bad deal is worse than no deal at all. Mr. President, you are getting played at the table. Take a walk. It's okay. It's time to strengthen your hand. Please do not prop up this regime with tens of billions of dollars in relief from sanctions. They are using that money to finance terror and overthrow foreign governments aligned with America. And that is with a bad economy and oil half the price. Don't make a slew of permanent concessions on our side in exchange for temporary concessions on the part of the Iranians. Show strength, not weakness. Too many Americans have shed their blood to make our great nation what it is today. We need strength in your voice and an articulation of resolve that there will be no death to America. It is not okay for Iran to wipe Israel off the map. We demand the release of our Americans being unjustly imprisoned in their nation, which includes a United States Marine. Where is the passion to free Amir now and the others of our fellow citizens wrongfully kept in their jails? Play the pocket aces, Mr. President. America's greatness, its exceptionalism, its strength is nothing to ever apologize for. About a month and a half ago, I was with former President George Bush, and a couple things that he said then strike me, and I want to reference them here today. One is very simple. He says, the world needs America to lead. And we can have a different understanding or philosophy on tactics of what that means. And it's something that we all know to be true. The world needs America to lead. The other was a story about him throwing out the first pitch at Yankee Stadium right after 9/11. He knew the stadium was going to be filled up. It was the World Series. It was right after 9/11. America was watching, and they were looking for something to be able to celebrate. Now, he was down getting ready to come out of the dugout wearing a bulletproof vest, and he has a conversation with Derek Jeter. And Derek Jeter asked the president whether or not he was going to throw it from the top of the mound or the front of the mound. And the president asked, well, what should I do? And Derek Jeter says, you have to throw it from the top of the mound or they won't respect you. A few moments later, the president's getting ready to walk out onto the field. And Derek Jeter said one other last word of advice. His last words were, don't bounce it, they'll boo you. We need a perfect strike here, Mr. President, from the top of the mound. And don't bounce it. Don't bring home a bad deal. The resulting boos would be the least of America's problems. Right now is a time for strength and not weakness. And for that reason, I once again want to thank the gentleman for bringing this important special order here tonight, and I yield back.
I thank my colleague for his remarks and reminding us of the stakes. Also, Mr. Speaker, in a recent hearing held by the newly formed task force to investigate terror financing, one expert we heard from described the threat posed by just one of the many Iranian-backed terror groups. He told us that, quote, Hezbollah remains one of the most capable terrorist organizations in the world. The group's original aims were to establish a radical Shia Islamist theocracy in Lebanon and to destroy Israel. However, in recent years, Hezbollah has, quote, established cells and infrastructure in places across the globe, from Latin America and Africa to Europe and Asia. And as a former Hezbollah leader confirmed years ago, and I quote, Hezbollah has been receiving since 1982 all kinds of moral, political, and material backing from the Islamic Republic of Iran. We must consider the implications that lifting sanctions could have on Iran's ability to export terror and finance military operations around the world. To this very day, we know that Iran remains the most active and largest state sponsor of terrorism. The wide array of terror activities Iran either supports financially or militarily include, but are not limited to, Hezbollah, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hamas, the Houthi in Yemen, Shiite militias in Iraq, militants in Afghanistan, while also maintaining its own terrorism apparatus, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Notably, many of the terror financing experts we have heard from throughout our terror task force hearings have emphasized their concerns over the Obama administration's willingness to lift sanctions and free up billions of dollars for the regime to use at large. Many experts agree that these sanctions have, without a doubt, diminished Iran's ability to support terrorism and proliferation. It is shocking to think that the current administration would provide billions of dollars in a windfall for the Iranian regime in return for promises that Iran will limit its nuclear weapons pursuit without stringent mechanisms that can guarantee Iran will not use that money to send paychecks to militants or the family of militants who plan to use it for attacks against innocent civilians. Sanctions relief will provide money Iran can continue to use to set up and enhance military training groups for Hezbollah and Hamas and groups in northern Africa. It is money Tehran can continue to send for covert weapons shipments and support terror operations across the globe. Lifting economic sanctions will allow Iran to again use the international banking sector and make it more difficult to prevent them from conducting transfers and finding ways to support illicit terror groups. Mr. Speaker, we must wake up and recognize that the Iranian threat is much greater than the administration would have us believe. The threat is complex, multifaceted, and we must be combating the Iranian regime on multiple fronts, instead of providing the regime billions of dollars in bonus money, all for agreeing to cooperate and pretend, if only for a short time, that they will act in good faith and adhere to international law and norms. I'm also joined this evening by my colleague from Florida, Congressman Ron DeSantis, himself a veteran of the Navy JAG Corps, and he has been outspoken on these issues, and I'm pleased to yield him as much time as he may consume.
Well, I thank my friend from Pennsylvania. I was listening intently to our colleague from New York talk about the president needing to get up on the top of the mound and throw a perfect strike here with this deal. And I've seen the president throw a baseball, and I'm like, Lord, help us if that's what we need to stop this, because I think we're in a major, major pickle here, and it's been the result of bad policies from the beginning. This House, it's almost 2 years ago where this House voted in the summer of 2013 to increase sanctions on Iran, and we did that with over 400 votes on a bipartisan basis. And that was really the obvious thing to do at the time, because Iran, the leadership of Iran, the mullahs, were chafing under the sanctions regime that was in place. And the way to deal with a country like Iran, with the leadership that are dedicated to militant Islam, is when they're starting to chafe, you turn the screws harder. And we did that here, and we did the right thing. Harry Reid in the Senate would not bring that up for a vote. The president decided, rather than do that route, he would simply provide unilateral sanctions relief to Iran, say this is a gesture of good faith. Now we want you to reciprocate with your nuclear program. And basically Iran, from that time forward, has said, go fly a kite. We're not giving up anything. And so the agreement that we seem to be on the verge of submitting to the Congress allows Iran to keep their entire nuclear infrastructure. The underground bunker at Fordo, it's fortified against a missile attack. Why do you need to fortify a nuclear facility against a missile attack if it's for peaceful purposes? So they get to keep that. They have a heavy water reactor in Iraq that they get to keep. That's used to produce plutonium. They don't need it for peaceful purposes. They have advanced centrifuges that they're allowed to keep. Again, no use of those for peaceful purposes. And so Iran is basically in a situation where, if you turn back the clock almost 2 years, when this House voted those sanctions with over 400 votes, if you asked Iran and the Iranian leadership what they most wanted, they said, well, look, we want to keep our nuclear infrastructure, but we want these sanctions. And guess what? That looks to be what's going to happen. And that is going to be a very, very dangerous and bad deal. And I do think it's worth pointing out, as much as we can, the nature of this regime. They're not only fomenting problems in the Middle East, they're not only dedicated to the destruction of Israel, they're dedicated to the destruction of the United States. The most deadly attack on U.S. Marines since Iwo Jima was in 1983 at the Marine Corps barracks in Beirut, when Hezbollah, which was supported by Iran, bombed and killed 220 U.S. Marines, another 21 personnel. That is major amounts of American blood on their hands. In Iraq, 2006, 2007, 2008, they were responsible for killing hundreds of our service members through the Shiite militias that were operating as their proxy forces, and may have killed as many as 1,500. So again, that's major, major American blood on their hands. This is a regime that has never, since 1979, showed any evidence of changing or deviating from their ideology rooted in militant Islam. They are a danger not only to the region, but to the world. And I think you're starting to see, well, we've seen now for some time, since this president's taken office, Iran has steadily increased its influence and power in the region. They're the #1 actor in Iraq by far. They're now battling for Yemen with the Houthis. They're the #1 patron of Hamas on the Gaza Strip. They're the #1 patron of Hezbollah in Lebanon. And they're the #1 patron of Assad in Syria. And so this is a massive Shiite crescent throughout the Middle East. And guess what? When Sunni Arabs see our administration bending over backwards to cut deals with Iran, the Shiite-backed militias that are backed by Iran in Iraq, they're the ones fighting ISIS. That makes the average Sunni Arab say, you know what, I'm much more likely to want to join ISIS than have to live under Shiite oppression. And so the president's policy, I think, has been bad for expanding Iran's influence, but I think it also has the effect of driving more Sunni Arabs into the hand of ISIS. And so it's a lose-lose policy. And so I thank my friend from Pennsylvania for having this discussion. I hope that this bad deal doesn't happen, but if it does, then we need to have robust debate in the House. We need to pick apart the deal piece by piece and show how this is not something that's good for the security in the world. And we can see that already before the deal's even been agreed to, because you see an arms race in the Middle East with the Sunni Arab states that has been underway now for some time. That is a direct result of the bad policies that this administration has engaged in vis-a-vis Iran. So Iran, the regime in Iran, is an enemy of the country. We need to recognize that, and we need to make sure that any deal that comes to this Congress, that we scrutinize, and any deal that allows Iran to maintain a nuclear capacity is voted down resoundingly. And I yield back.
I thank my colleague, and plenty to consider as the negotiations continue between the P5+1 and Iran as we look forward to what deal will be produced. Again, the concerns that have been expressed by my colleagues from Florida and from New York, we must be vigilant, particularly when you look at the context of what has been happening with Iran over the 36 years. Again, today we mark the sad anniversary of the murder of Bobby Steedham at the hands of Iranian-backed terrorists. And Bobby is one of many victims that this regime, this Islamist regime out of Iran, has been responsible for over nearly 4 decades. Going forward, an agreement wherein Iran would not even be required to actually stop enriching uranium merits our grave concern. In light of a final agreement's far-reaching implications for the security of both our allies in the region and our own national defenses, we must be extremely vigilant. As a member who sits on a House committee that has been tasked with investigating the financial backers that keep international terror groups well-armed and operating, we cannot ignore Iran's leading role in international terror financing. For as many experts have warned our committee, once the administration agrees to lift all economic sanctions and free up billions of dollars for the Iranian regime, there is no guarantee that deepening the regime's pockets will not result in increased financing for acts of terror that will kill innocent people. In addition, contrary to what has been publicly suggested by the President, it will be all but impossible to simply slap those economic sanctions back into effect should Iran break the terms of a final nuclear weapons deal. We must look to the past and consider the present situation. We owe as much to all those who were murdered at the hands of the Iranian regime and by terror groups who would use Iranian money and weapons to take the lives of innocent men, women, and children. I thank the Speaker for allowing us to have this special order tonight, and I yield back.